Thank you, Jason. What a great panel and a good way to start the morning. I run a group in New York that many of you may be familiar with that started in the Bay Area by Gary Wolf and Kevin Kelly called the Quantified Self, and there were some references to it this morning. We are really a community of advanced users, much like what we see here on the panel this morning. This is very much like a Quantified Self meetup this morning, which is nice, like a little show and tell. And we come together in 43 cities around the world to share stories about what individuals are doing using tools, technology, methods, frameworks, systems to understand themselves a little bit better. Many of the individuals are interested in health, like we heard this morning, but there are also many folks who are tracking cognition, tracking aspects of productivity, tracking their sex and dating lives. It goes on and on and on. It's quite fascinating. So we come together really to share those stories. We have 3 prime questions that we ask in Quantified Self, which is, what did you do, how did you do it, and what did you learn? So that's, I wear many hats. That's one of the things that I do is run the group in New York. You can go to quantifiedself.com to learn more about our organization and our community. I also teach at NYU in a grad program there called ITP, and I teach a really fun course that's called DIY Health. And it is kind of an intersection between behavior change, quantified self, and cybernetics. So we use cybernetics systems design to think about how we create a system of self-care and whatever that means to the individual student. So it's a lot of fun. And I also am a partner in a firm called Prehype, where we focus on incubating startups for corporations, some of which are in the health field as well. So one housekeeping that Esther reminded me of is that I don't know the hashtag of the conference, but I think Esther tweeted out Get Conference.
Get 2012.
Get 2012, thank you. So I did tweet out Get Conference. I'll make that correction later. And when I just tweeted that out, and I also included Eric, Larry, and David's Twitter handle, so you can look that up for the panel this morning. So that's my introduction. We are going to have a little discussion about what we heard this morning, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So keep me on track on time. I want to spend about half time talking with the group here, and then open it up to the group. And I think we have microphones out there in the lanes up here. So the last thing that you ended with, Larry, made me think both what you ended with and also what you showed before, the before and after shot that you had. I immediately thought about, Eric, is there a before and after of our gut? Is there some kind of visualization? Because that before-after shot that's so powerful to look at, Larry, in your early slide, are there visualizations or visuals that we can look at in terms of the kinds of things that are happening with microbiomes and in the gut? Curious question, more than anything.
Sure. One of the things that surprised us was how little change there was in the gut over time. I mean, it's easy to, certainly things change, but the 10 or 20 bacteria that comprise the vast majority of all the counts that were there seemed to be surprisingly resilient, and not only resilient, but it wasn't just the same species. It was exactly the same strain, or one of its descendants. So the before and after, certainly there was for me, because I had the food poisoning, which sort of reprogrammed that whole ecosystem. But for the most part, the before and after would look pretty similar.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is the piece that one of the things that I always tell my students is that when we look at designing any kind of system around health in the body, is that not knowing the current state and having kind of a black box around the current state just doesn't get us anywhere if we're going to design a system to get to an improved future state. And much of what I've heard is that this morning. So could you guys talk a little bit about how important that is around knowing current states?
Yeah, maybe if I just kind of continue on that. One of the things I didn't talk about today is we're really interested in looking at the current state of the microbiome and using that, especially in pediatric patients, as maybe a screening test for inflammatory bowel disease. One of the problems is they're all very weak signals because, as you could see after I got food poisoning, it was only a day or two before new microbes appeared. So those weren't like perfectly optimized microbes for my ecosystem. It was probably just whatever I happened to come in contact with. So right now we've had some success at diagnosing things like inflammatory bowel disease where there's a profound change in the gut by doing these sort of case control studies. But I think that if we could get more of a baseline, there's probably a lot of conditions where we would see that baseline change, but we wouldn't be able to, because you're starting from such a different place from each person, you wouldn't be able to observe the same change in a typical case control study. So I think it is really important to get that baseline from lots of different people and maybe even longitudinal samples so you can see the before and after. Are we looking at it after? Or?
Well, I think it's more than before and after. Many of you know about Mike Snyder, who's head of genetics at Stanford, who wrote in Cell last month. Made me feel sort of good in a way. He did just what I did, took the genome as the context, and then did sort of once a month lots of blood work. The only thing is he got 1,000 times as many variables as I did for each of those. So instead of looking at the SNPs, he did the full genome at 140x coverage, which is probably the most accurate human genome ever done. And then he did the full proteomics and metabolomics of himself over time. And he also did the full transcriptomics, which is the RNA reading off the DNA, so you're seeing what it's actually expressing. And he did it over time, and he could see 2 viruses coming on and going away, and the body's reaction to that, and the onset of type 2 diabetes in himself, which he had shown he had a genetic predisposition for. Now that is what we don't have for things like IBD. For all the literature, it always starts out saying, well, we really don't know exactly how it is that you get this autoimmune turning on. Well, like, hello, it's time to know. So let's just get some time series of that frequency. And you can see from my charts, if you were doing it once a year, you wouldn't see squat. Okay, and maybe once a day is too much, I don't know, but somewhere in between. But I think one of the biggest revolutions we're going to see in this coming decade is, for the first time, we're going to see the onset of disease and the body's reaction to it so much earlier than when we finally have symptoms. By that time, it's too late. You've damaged your body. And so I think that is why these time series are so important, and why getting the full proteomics and metabolomics, so you can be looking at thousands of these things, and the transcriptomics, seeing your DNA turn on and off. I think that's the biggest thing coming. So it's a generalization of your before and after.
Yeah, I mean, in the past and really the present, medicine has been all about taking a snapshot. I mean, it's really pretty ridiculous. You go in for a routine exam, maybe, you're supposed to go in every 2 years or whatever it is. You get, your heart rate taken, your weight, et cetera, that's written down dutifully in your chart, and then you come back 2 years later. I mean, one of the exciting things, about covering this space and being among the people that are really revolutionizing the technology and the health aspects is the technology is now here to really take these dynamic readings. I mean, the human body is dynamic, it's not static. And that's one of the things that, even with genetics, which, still mostly static. I mean, we have epigenetics and some other things that change, but that seems to be a baseline, and we seem to be moving in a progression. We did a lot of work in genetics, and now we're moving into these more dynamic areas like proteomics, microbiomics. And I'm actually looking too, at my part of the world in Silicon Valley, there are so many apps now I can't even keep track of what's going on, and Quantified Self, how one measures oneself. But this all seems to be coalescing into something kind of exciting, which is that we'll be able to monitor the human body and other aspects of nature in real time, whether it's daily or weekly or monthly. And I think we're going to have some profound revelations And certainly it's going to improve healthcare and our understanding of ourselves. But to be at that moment now is kind of exciting, and I think this meeting, especially the joining of environment and genes, finally happening. This is the third year of the meeting? Sure, yeah. I mean, I think I'm really anticipating today because I think we're beginning to really see this dynamic process, the way things really work.
Right. So we're here at Harvard Medical School, and this makes me think about this real time, the time series, the dynamic aspect of ourselves. How might this change the practice of medicine, where, as we all know, I go in once a year to get my physical with one marker set. How might this change the delivery of medicine in a much more dynamic, real-time state where we're tracking this kind of information?
Well, it's going to be completely disruptive.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's going to change everything.
Medicine will be something totally different over the next 10 or 20 years that it is now. It's sort of like, what happened to geology, if those of you know it, before and after plate tectonics, when you finally had a way to understand how the Earth actually created all the stuff it's doing. Now it became a science instead of rock collecting, and we're going through the same thing. I think the really biggest problem and the thing that will slow this down for the general population the most is medical schools take a long time to create a new set of doctors. I mean, my feeling is I'm hoping a few of the medical schools will get this digital transformation that is in every other industry it's touched has completely changed it. The winners and losers are separated out. But I would love to see every first-year medical student doing what Eric is doing crossed with what Mike Snyder is doing. In other words, not just the human body, but also the microbiome, as part of their self-education about medicine. And as you say, the technology is getting to the point to do that. I don't know if there's any medical school in the country that's doing that, but that's what they have to do if they're going to change the mindset of these young people to understand when you go from a digitally poor to a digitally super rich world, regardless of the field, in the digitally super rich world, everything is done differently. And that's what we're going to see happen over the next 10 or 20 years.
Do you think that in the interim, that what might emerge is, and I had sent this out to you guys beforehand, a new kind of role of a healthcare professional who is able to make sense and interpret this kind of real-time data? If we know that the doctors today don't have time for it, don't understand it, is there something that might emerge in the interim over the next 10 to 20 years that will help us get there and help augment that?
Well, there's a step that needs to actually happen, which I hope people in this room can help facilitate, which is really interpreting this data. I mean, I think it's Mike Snyder who said, you're going to have the $1 genome and the $1 million interpretome. And that seems to be really the new frontier, and that's before it really even reaches the physician. I mean, there will be certainly aspects that can enter medicine and should be entering it right now. We're way behind on that, but some of these infrastructure questions are really, I think, the next frontier. And if I were in college or an undergraduate right now, I'd be looking into bioinformatics, things like that, because that's the real frontier. I mean, I have a whole talk on big data. I mean, we're into something which I didn't even know existed called yottabytes of data. If you took all the data that's been collected on me, that's 10 to the 23rd, and you took 500 gigabytes of data for every human being on the planet, you'd be in yottabytes of data. I mean, we don't have even close to the capacity of even storing that, but much less understanding it. So I think you're going to have some interim steps, but there's certainly some things that can be done now.
So I'm actually curious to know if you guys think it'll be doctors interpreting big data, or will it be computers?
I think they'll be at the end of the line.
Doctors running.
Yeah.
running
Well, there'll be other humans too, but
Right.
we have I think we have levels of expertise that are only now beginning to be even understood what they might be. But the doctor's really the last. In fact, I think someday we'll all be wearing biomonitors or having some computer program that just signals us and the doctor when something needs to be dealt with. Otherwise, it just hums along and keeps track of all sorts of things, automatically.
Yeah, I mean, the role of the doctor, I think, is what I've seen in lots of the other digital transformations that I've been involved in, they go from, a lot of doctors are not having much fun these days. You know, they're in these machineries, these commercial machine things where it's how many patients you get through in a day, and that, you know, the insurance company is determining what tests should be done, not you. Yeah. Nobody wants to do that. That's why they came into medical school. So the idea of I think doctors are incredibly valuable, some of the most important people in our society, because they have this lifetime of experience. There's no artificial intelligence program that can equal that, but they don't get to use it. And so if you get into more of a consulting role and you don't have this factory, you're not on the factory floor, but you're actually sitting back and getting to think a little bit. And you're seeing this, particularly in concierge medicine, beginning to emerge as a way of doing things. They're going to be much happier, much more productive. I mean, I like reading hundreds of scientific papers in the medical literature. I can actually get to them without paying $30 an article, which is what's the case if you're not in a research university. If you're a civilian, you know, good luck to you. So there needs to be these people who have this stored expertise that can interpret what is coming. I wish I had more that I could work with that instead of having to do so much of it on my own.
Well, we get this question very often at Quantified Self meetups is, you know, the types of folks who come to QS, show and tells, and present their data and are self-trackers are very highly motivated to do this kind of thing. So how do we get, any thoughts on how we get the civilians, the individuals, to participate in this kind of detective sleuthing of their own lives by tracking data, tracking behaviors, tracking other aspects of themselves? And then, I mean, I don't think that people are interested in data per se, right? But is there a way that we can make that something much more participatory and fun? And I think Genomics Art is playing with that out in the lobby.
Yeah, I mean, you have to add some value to the data, and we're probably not at a stage where that added value is for the most part going to improve their health. Mm-hmm. So, you know, at that point, what you can offer them is interesting ways to visualize the data, because it should be personal. And you know, like you said, you've got a lot of folks at your meetups who realize that it is pretty fun, it's interesting.
Well, this revolution is, as far as I can see, being driven outside of the medical establishment by consumer companies. And the thing that motivates most people is, you know, doing things like wearing Fitbits to measure your steps and caloric burns, Zeos, which I wear every night. I've done 400 nights of sleep, 30-second intervals each night. And it's all up in the cloud. 23andMe, all the data is in the cloud of a startup, and vastly more data than any medical clinical trial you can think of. And so how are we going to, as that just exponentially increases, how do we get that data so that it can be mashed up, you can get it out of the cloud? In other words, you want it to be your data, you can access it, you can multiply it times, you can get your sleep, you know, with your exercise, with your caloric intake, with your microbiome from your stool. That's where we're going. And it's almost, it's like, you know, it's so much faster, the progress, because it's out in the market and there's all this competition, than is going on in the traditional medical environment. And I think as far as motivating ordinary people, almost all of it is weight loss and exercise. I mean, that's where it all starts. That's what my first 5 years were about. Then you realize, well, sleep is actually way more important than our society thinks it is. And so you get into that. And then finally, you realize that actually it's stress that's causing almost all our chronic diseases. But who has time to spend the time to lower your stress?
Right.
So there's some wonderful things that are coming of new techniques, EM-Wave PC and other things that that help you learn how to be less stressful.
I actually think the vast majority of people are not quantified selfers.
Right.
And in fact, they really will be completely uninterested in this, especially healthy people. Mm-hmm. And it's actually something that needs to be thought out in a very careful way. And in fact, there are a lot of smart people thinking about this. There are entire companies that are devoted right now to figuring out how to motivate people. And I find it fascinating. I mean, you've got gaming as a possibility. I mean, I'm a complete addict to frequent flyer miles and things like that. You know, I'll fly in the steerage to get the extra miles. And so people have their, their motivations. And, others, it will be health. Maybe they have a disease running in the family. Right. And I think these are areas, again, of study. We need to find out what does motivate people. And I have a favorite little image of a guy reaching for a chocolate chip cookie, and the mousetrap slaps on the hand. I mean, but these are important things. And when you talk to physicians, if I go talk to grand rounds, I always get this funny look from all the doctors. Well, why are you telling us about all these tests? We tell our patients to, eat right and exercise, and I go, well, how's that working for you?
Right.
So, I think it is a huge issue, but the average person is not going to be motivated by, what we're motivated by, most of us in this room. And I think it's got to be seamless in some ways. Your monitors have to be something that's as easy as putting on a shirt or a pair of socks or something. And it's all electronic. And like I said earlier, I think it reaches a point of automation where it's only when something goes wrong is there a signal that's given out and then action taken. Because most people are not going to certainly track their stool once a day or once a week or ever. If they are forced to do that. So
why don't we get questions from the audience? We have a few more minutes left on this panel.
There's microphones, and if there's going to, and one of the things that we can do if we're going to have multiple questions, so we can try to stay on track, is maybe have multiple questions asked in a row, and then the panelists will field them.
That sounds good.
Question, queue up, and we'll just run through five questions real quick.
Is this on?
Yep.
Yep. Well, you all are three excellent pioneers in the field. Let me just be a little devil's advocate here. As a physician, when you're a physician and you get sick, you ask somebody else to take care of you rather than treating yourself in the eyes of being objective. And the question is, you guys are given tremendous advantages for doing it yourself. You're clearly very motivated. Do you see any downside to being your own diagnostician and, in some cases, therapist? Thank you.
Greg.
Yeah. Hi, Greg Biggers from Genomira. So measuring the microbiome, the number 2 as Jason called it, our cars have really sophisticated instrumentation for measuring their exhaust system constantly, right? What's the state of the art for the equipment necessary to measure the human exhaust system now, and how soon can we have equipment in a consumer's home that lets us do that?
Mm-hmm. One more.
Jeff Lester with Genome Fire. As a medical doctor who sees patients and is interested in genetics and whole genome sequencing, the devil's advocate line was stolen from me. But I look at all this as a doctor, and I see a lot of smart PhDs who really have no idea what they're doing when they're trying to bring this to patients and the doctors in the clinic. And my position is that basically it's going to be the sequencing company job to do all the interpretation, and then doctor just getting the information they need very, very clear. I just wanted to get your take on that.
I'd like to say right from the start that I have been in a partnership with multiple doctors through all of this. And without the doctors, I would never have gotten to where I am now in terms of my knowledge on this. Some of them are more old school and don't get what's happening. Some of them are very enlightened. But I really value working with doctors, and I seek them out and wish I could find more that would want to engage.
Yeah, I would agree with Larry on that. I mean, my experimental land project, my poor physician at UCSF oversaw the entire project. But I would actually expand on what you're saying in terms of what the gaps and barriers. You talked about smart PhDs, but there's also communities like the IT community. Again, out where I am in Silicon Valley, there's now, it's a very hot topic now. The Health 2.0, it's getting funded, apps, et cetera. It's mostly engineers, and they don't know that much about healthcare. And I think there is going to be a continuing disconnect there, and we need people to bridge those gaps.
Right, so some of the earlier questions were downsides, and then also state-of-the-art from Greg, state-of-the-art. I wanted to say data exhaust off the body, but that's not quite what you said, right?
Sure, yeah, I can tackle that one. I think for the time being, sequencing is probably going to happen in a lab, or you can imagine it happening in the clinic. Maybe some other folks later today will tell us it'll be happening in the home too. I would imagine that, if folks were interested, you could collect samples quite easily in the home and mail them out, which is, I think, what Larry does quite a bit for his blood tests.
And I would, just for the record, this business about somehow stool samples, there's something distasteful about them. I would take a dozen stool samples for one blood sample. Getting needles stuck in you is so much worse than just taking a little shovel and putting it in a vial. And I mean,
we'll just let that one go.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap up, so let's take one more question from this side, and then we'll stop.
I'm curious about health and medical interventions. Eric, you didn't talk about probiotics or things that one could do given this different change of travel, et cetera. And Larry, you didn't talk about fecal transplants for IBD patients. So.
Right.
Yeah, so I didn't talk about, I didn't give my yogurt talk. I usually follow that talk with my yogurt talk, but since it was only 8 minutes, I'll just ask you guys to check out our article in Scientific American next month.
And then I take about 500 billion bacteria every day. So about a dozen different, it's sort of a cocktail of different commercially available probiotics. I have no idea whether it does any good, and the scientific literature is completely neutral on that. All the meta-studies have shown that, for instance, helping in IBD, it's not known whether it does. I think fecal transplants are the future and make a lot more sense, because what you have is the densest microbial community on the planet Earth inside your gut. That's incredibly biochemically interconnected between these hundreds of species. And to think you're going to approximate that with a few pills with individual strains is crazy. And so I think, the FDA doesn't approve fecal transplants. There are only a few doctors brave enough to move forward in this area, but it's rapidly increasing the number of doctors looking at it. And from a logical point of view, it's the only thing that makes any sense. I don't see how else you can get your microbiome reconstituted and the complexity that it should be to be healthy.
Just a super quick comment. I think you have to, all of this data collection in the end, as a user, as a layperson, has to have some actionable, part to it. And that's been one of the problems with this data. What do you do with it? So I think that's a good thought maybe to leave people with. How can you take action based on this that makes sense? And how can science help?
Right, so I want to thank everyone. There's also a Quantified Self talks at 1 o'clock today in room 217, so we can continue the discussion there and during the break. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.